Sprites and pixies plunged back into the eddy. The churning crowd of fairies heaved and waxed, warping into a massive pile. Sedwa's fury was tangible. The tension of her mood enthralled the fairies into a whirl. They churned like a billowy skirt, rotating slow and broad below, but knotted ever tighter, thinner, higher. Sedwa was drawn up to perch the apex where she could spy her prey and their desperate escape. Sedwa's desperation to capture made her hysterical, and the instability of her mood rocked the foundation of her tower. The nauseous fairies began to teeter in their negotiation against gravity. Twisted with frustration and seizing with anticipation, Sedwa played in favor of the potential fall. She leaned in. Sprites and elves rained down, tumbling over and pouring out. The fairy body spilled into a breaker that swept down the breadth of the trail. Sedwa dared a suicidal step off her pedestal, but her foot was caught by a pixie, tripped and tossed up to serve as a step. The rhythm of Sedwa's gait was as fluid as her hoard. Step after step was met by some fairy cresting the crowd scrolling beneath her. Pace by pace she made her way, skating on the backs of the stumbling fae. The swell poured itself out before her. A carpet of bodies sprawled and prostrate to convey her forward. "Out of the way," Cassandra ordered with a tone to foreshadow her birthright. Tarakon's stomach nodded as he watched her dare to stand. She reached into the air, raking up the rays of sunlight that once again trickled between the leaves. She clenched her fist, compacting the light into a tight orb, then pitched it toward the fairy horde. It was a veritable shooting star, with thistle rays that pricked the darkness. It flew, screaming like a comet, from her hand to crash and crater. Scorched dirt pitted from the impact, coughing up a cloud of black ash. Sedwa raked up breezes that cleared the plume, and the wave of fairy bodies washed through the smoke unfazed. The pixie princess then retaliated. She cartwheeled through her next step, plucking from the rushing current of bodies beneath her a fistful of sprites. The momentum of her hurdle lent speed to her hurl as she pitched the sprites like javelins. The little wicked sprites with their glowing skin squealed giddily as they scratched the air with sparks-spitting streams. "Duck!" Cassandra screamed. She dodged beneath Daryl's swat at a sprite. The iron blade cut the trajectory, rending the fairy into a cloud of myriad sparkles. The glitter hung in the air at the point of impact, providing a point of reference by which to measure the speed of their escape. Too quickly, Sedwa's hand raked through the cloud to clear her path of pursuit. Fairies quilted together in a haphazard patchwork to get ahead of their princess's tipped toes. Asymmetrical limbs, stretched and bowed against reason, plaited over one another, pulling and dragging and shifting. Grimaced faces were warped with giddy sadism. The colorful flickering of the sprite's illumination lit the silhouettes of the rolling bodies like lightning among the angry tumbling clouds. Sedwa raised a pointed finger. Her gesture was sufficient to hurl a pixie from under her tread toward the cart. The pixie landed gracefully on the bed of the wagon and bared its teeth, ready to nip at any bare flesh. Eloise's quick kick sent the pixie reeling back to bounce twice across the gravel before being tread over and assimilated back into the oncoming horde. "Inevitable!" roared the fairy horde in unison. Sedwa's words conducted every element in nature to recite her shrieks. "It is the autumn of your existence." Eloise readied herself with a deep breath. She blew, and the whistle of her blowing kicked winds into a tempest. Sedwa conducted up a parade of sprites whose gossamer wings beat the winds into submission. Their chore complete, they streaked into the canopy. "Damn!" Eloise snapped. "This thing will not stop!" Daryl cried. His eyes were locked on a fault carving after the wheel of their cart. Rhythmically, the eyes of the nymph crested the furrow to stare back at him. Daryl's scraping of the axle warded the wheel against any direct approach, so the nymph darted ahead to haunt the ground trampled under the unicorns. The burrowing stopped. The wheel mounted up the furrow. The nymph erupted from its hovel. The wheel pitched violently and the cart careened. The months of rehearsal for De Tutal had settled Cassandra's sense of balance. She made herself a fulcrum on which the cart could sway. Pressed heels negotiated against the tilt, lifting one side, distributing the toss, and steadying the cart. It crashed back to the trail, but every heel caught. With the wheels back at ground level, the nymph attempted again to anchor the cart. Briars whipped at the spokes, stringing through and nipping at their momentum. The cart sputtered as it tripped against the nymph's bramble grasp. The fairy swarm grew closer. Sedwa swept her arm low, scooped out an elf, and hurled it at the cart. Terracon dropped the hammer of his battle-axe on the elf as it shot toward them, smashing it out of its flight and straight into the ground. "They are gaining!" "Out of the way!" Eloise barked, shouldering Darrell away from the sideboard. She staked the nymph to the ground with a beautifully carved red spear that she had found uselessly lying along the opposite sideboard of the cart. Iridescent slimes erupted from the wound. The nymphs, twitching against the staking, swatted the red stave. The point of the spear, however, was too well plotted, and marked a spot by which to measure how quickly they were progressing away. Darrell pulled Eloise beneath the horizon of the sideboard in time to avoid another spray of poisoned darts shot from the trees. They traded relieved smiles, but their momentary pleasure was broken by a foreign curse word spit from the dwarf's lips. Curious as to what had deterred the grub this time, Nicken glanced back only to watch his spear falling away, and its lanyard coil on the cart's bed unraveling through the passing distance. Ignorant of all else, he dove from the driver's seat into the bed of the wagon, frantically fishing for the spear's leash. He snatched the cord as the last measure began to spool away, and fiercely tugged. The spear leaned from the tension, then bowed. The toe of the escaping cart finally popped the spear's point from the nymph's translucent belly. "Are you crazy?" Nicken snapped as he turned on Eloise. The spear bounced and chattered behind the cart as Nicken started to reel it in. The unseelie cord were hooked by the spear, fascinated with its cord anchored to their target. A tendril of sylphs and sprites snaked and coiled toward the jostling spear, creeping up the lanyard that served as a bridge to the bed of the cart. "Let it go!" Eloise tried to make it in order, but could only scream. "Tosh!" Nicken blurted back. He wound the leash around his elbow, then braced himself into a deep stance. With a flick of his wrist, he ripped from his belt one of his drawstring bag grenades. He threw it straight up, and the cart pulled away from beneath. Its collision with the ground was a sufficient catalyst for the unstable arrangement of ingredients, and the fabric was rent by a thermal cloud contaminated with iron shavings. Nicken's violent tug on the leash whipped the spear through the smoke and smudged it free of the fairy infestation. He then reeled the weapon safely back on board. The fairy stampede broke rank as it approached the iron-tainted smoke screen. The current splayed into separate rivulets to stream around the nauseous black column, and then to reconvene as a single mass on the other side. "Fork!" Terracon was half deaf to, and half doubtful of what Darrell had just said, and made the sergeant clarify. "In the trail! A fork!" They took turns, tearing their attention away from the wall of fairies crashing ever closer to peek at Darrell's warning. Their understanding was a patchwork of stolen glances, no single eye having seen the whole dilemma. Darrell braved to stand, grabbed Nicken with one hand by collar scruff and leather suspender, and plopped him back in the driver's seat. The dwarf tried to tantrum against the handling, but could spare only a momentary scowl before recognizing the immediacy of the threat. They drove so quickly that the trail was just a streak of tan scrawled between impressions of foliage, whisking past as a collage of bright greens, grays, and dusky browns. Where once the path strolled ahead to some point too dim and distant to perceive, now trees were sprouted and divided the tan streak. The contrast between the two trails could not have been more distinct, and all good reason played in favor of the northern path. The discussion earlier that day had made it clear that this was the route they wanted. Out of the gully, up the ridge, on a high road directly to Caldara, where Cassandra could assume residence until a full escort was arranged. The trail was bright, with beams of sunlight trickling through the breaks in the canopy. Even the twitter of birds sounded louder from that trail. The invitation was not as forthcoming from the southbound path, with its steep descent hidden in the shadow of the mountain. The dark path was silent save for the rustle of bushes. The trolls lurking in the underbrush did a meager job of hiding, betrayed by their flopping and writhing tails. "Go left," Terracon ordered. Darrell agreed. "Are you mad?" Rusty butted. "It's an ambush. Go right." "We are heading to Caldara." For all the fun Terracon and Rusty had had at Nicken's expense, his tone now lost all cordiality. Rusty abandoned the captain and pleaded with the dwarf. "They know we are headed to Caldara." "We'll need to turn back into the woods to get to Caldara. The South Fork will only dump us in the wasteland." "That's it. Go right," Cassandra chimed in. "Will you listen to me?" Terracon was cracking with frustration. "You said it yourself. We will end up in the Vorsand's north wasteland." She then addended, "where the fairies will not follow us." Terracon was too stunned to speak. Nicken was too bright to abandon the suggestion. A cracked lash drove the cart south. The fairy choir groaned with Sedwa's frustration at seeing the cart take the dare. She danced and twirled, inspiring sylphs to begin carting the storm from the North Fork to the Southern Trail. Until it arrived, there was still the threat of the trolls, whom lurked at the threshold of the fork. Their hooves clattered against the wagon's bedboards as they assailed the cart from all directions. Darrell made short work of every troll he spied. Against their kind he had no worries. Easily 3 times their size and armed with a broad-bladed short sword, he cleaved and rent their bodies, butchering them mercilessly. Berserk with frustration, his fury teased him with some semblance of authority, some control over his own life. He needed that comfort too much to care about the blood sprayed across his face. Rusty drew a knife, pressing her thumb against the pommel to steer the blade as she scratched at a threatening troll. Eloise intervened with a kick only moments after having ruptured the bones of another. When one sprung to land on the driver's bench, Nicken threw it a backhand strong enough to knock it into the air. It fell onto Terracon. The stun of the impact distracted the captain from the troll against whom he was already engaged, and it used the distraction to steal an advantage. A low sweep with its thick conical tail struck Terracon in the ankle that had coincidentally been ruined years before by a troll ambush. The irony was not lost on Terracon, nor was the pain as his joint suddenly felt as malleable as cork. He had to take a fall to keep his target in range of his axe. Even then, his swipe fell short, leaving only a long gash across the troll's face. Rusty dove in to rescue Terracon by staking the troll's head with her knife. Startled, Eloise screamed. She had stood too high over the sideboard and was nicked by a dart. She dropped to the floor, examining the gash. It wasn't deep, but she was not versed in poisons. "Shit!" she wept. "Eloise!" Terracon called while trying to reset his weak ankle. She gritted her teeth. "I can make this," she attempted to convince herself. "I can make this. Let us just keep going." Darrell slashed his blade to pry it free from another troll carcass. "Get up, you two!" He, Cassandra, and Rusty were not enough to deter the approaching swarm. Sylphs tore through the canopy and squealed with delight as the breaking branches tickled their naked bodies. Fairies flitted through the air, tinting it with the muted hues and fluorescent tones of their complexions. Always there were the tumbling appendages in pursuit, scratching onward, reaching after. The tide of bodies was closing the distance, bridging it with their lunges and little leaps. A thrashing pixie landed on the cart. Darrell's iron blade rent it myriad. More pixies bombarded on board. Soon the wave would drown the wagon. Weapons were brandished and slashed. Sunlight glinted off gilded hilts and iron edges. There were shouts and yelps. The dizzy confusion of instinct clouded the consciousness of combat. Terracon could not know if he was still lying on the wagon's bed, swatting aimlessly at the fairy swarm raining on them, or if he had pulled himself back onto his feet to stand against their volley. Life was still flush in his cheeks, his instinct for survival mattering only instant to instant. He was blind to any sequence or subsequence. There were memories woven into his muscle, almost more real than Cassandra's wails or Nicken's hollers. How to brace against a flinch when his father teased a lunge at him. How his mother would squeeze each finger on his hand in turn, and thereby transmit the fulcrum of the axe up and down the shaft of the handle. How to breathe out just enough air to keep a fire going while you took in another breath. Salvage what you could to make it just one more moment. It was the leaves, brown and crisp despite the early summer, raining and whisking past him, that ignited the frenzy. Sedwa had said it was the autumn of their existence. The dirt had sipped the green from every shoot and stalk and leaf, then gave such a gluttonous belch as to rattle off the withered foliage. The sylphs had stripped sheets of leaves from the canopy. Crisp, rust-red leaves blanketed them. Terracon could endure this whelm no more. He gasped, then resigned his breath to the searing passion of survival. He fell to his knees. His arms fell at his sides. His sigh erupted in an orange-hot plume cast over the cart. The leaves were reduced to kindling and dusted the passengers in ash. Cassandra screamed in protest. Her words were lost in the time and distance between them. She had read him as his idolatry and indulgence swelled into a fury which he could not control. The flames that poured from his body may have been defensive, but soon they would be warped into offense. Sedwa was perched on the curl of the wave. She rode the bow of the bodies breaking before her, braced herself in her surfing, and then leapt off in the moment before she was to have been spilled and sprawled like the other fairies caught in the tumult. An entourage of sprites whisked in as escort. They flung faster than her leap, crashing into and splashing through the conflagration conjured to shield the cart. They punctured a portal in the wall of flames, and through it dove the pixie princess. The ignited sprites whipped their trajectories into an orbit around their matriarch, whom was now mounted on the racing cart. Their whisking and waltzing strobed the shadows and wobbled the highlights. Sedwa had pounced her target, and the swarm closed in to herd the hunted into compliance. The passengers stared in awe at the diminutive body. She was a toddler in proportion, yet developed, yet gaunt. Her weathered periwinkle skin was craped over the plush and stretched taut across the bones. The ribs heaved with each breath as the pixie admired her prize. Despite the humane in her proportions, there was only animal in her eyes. Pacifiers, still draped across her jutting sternum, bore into memories of the missing, memories of the mourning. The loss of those potential lives, strung like medals around her neck, was suffocating. Having missed so many opportunities already, and now losing more, Darrell was inspired to defy. He brandished and swung his iron sword. Sedwa's fingers pinched the chopping blade. The sword bled an infectious patch of sanguine rust, pitted and sloughing flakes of decay. Theories on the Fae warped against themselves, imploding their plans of escape. Fairies were in sympathy with chaos, with impurity, with nature. The Forge was able to drive that out, to minimize the irregular, to attune and align and order. The abuses reverberated in the metal like a memory, which paralyzed the Fae with pity, and it was through that sympathy that the fairies could be wounded, broken, even beaten. Sedwa's single caress, however, had rendered worthless the labor of smiths across the country. Disarmed, instinct became a last weapon. Tarkon made a wild swing. His attempt to cleave the pixie with his axe was reprimanded with a bath of blisters scalded across his skin by whips of searing bolts. Every muscle in his body seized rigid with pain. Anguish leaked from his knotted throat. The axe slipped from his clenching, twitching fingers to thud against the cart bed's wooden planks. The seared air crisped and crackled as it slowly cooled. Just as slowly, the passengers turned their attention to the source of the blast. Beside Snicken stood Lord Marco, swathed in his charcoal-gray cloak, the hem of his hood breached by his blunt snout and its 3 jagged tusks. His beady eyes glinted from beneath the shadow of his cowl. He bore down on them with both his gaze and his offensive amulet. "I warned you she was not very poetic," Lord Marco snarled from his perch. Did not expect me, though, did you?" "Quiet," Sedwa commanded. Marco snorted tartly. "Pixie could be a witch. She rules the forest with no worthy command, leans on a cane that she knows will fold under her. And you, witch who thinks no differently, settled with her diversion of force, while I," he bleated smugly, "can bend you to bow. Well, Sedwa, are you welcome?" spitting to cap his point. His warning was clear to Cassandra. Tarkon whined, was curled fetal with pain. Rusty tried to shift herself between the pixie and princess, but Marco's looming made her defensive gesturing effectively futile. Darrell was castrated of his sword. Eloise was slowly sinking into the intoxicated depths in which Nesu already swam. Stiff with anxiety, Nicken waited for an opening, twitching the lash in his hand only enough to keep the unicorns charging down the trail. The trees whisked by too quickly to see the grain of their bark. The trail sank too quickly beneath the stampede of fairies still pouring in behind, though maintaining their distance. "You will submit to my demand, and I will wear your babe in my hair as a comb. I will relish in your gratitude as I cure it of the curse." "You said yourself that the branch is bare." Cassandra tried to buy time. "I can wait. It is the nature of time to pass away. A century is no more than a breath in the life of a world." "Well said," Marco bleated, conceitedly crediting himself for the pixie's vivid metaphor. Rusty clutched Cassandra tighter, and with eyes clutched against the daylight, pleaded, "Taoish, save us." "Black magic will arrive," Sedwa promised, her hollow black eyes never relinquishing their hold on Cassandra. Cassandra cowered against the backboard and struggled to calculate her deteriorating odds before they dwindled to nil. She had always run, but now there was nowhere to escape. She could not move faster than the cart was driving, even if she tried. The inevitability of her hypocrisies had at last caught up with her, or perhaps more appropriately, she had finally stumbled onto the inevitable conclusion of her hypocrisies. Black magic let her be a witch, let her tantrum, ceded the creation to her imagination, her will, her decisions. She reflected on Rusty's tale of black magic's frustration at the creation's constricted construction. Her efforts, too, were in vain, effectively having delivered her to Sedwa. She reflected on Nesu's moral that even gods change. She had wanted to change the world, but ran from the world she sought to change. She could not change that which she did not accept. The only reason she was not part of it was her will to stay out. She chose to deny existence, to refute it, to disapprove. She reflected on the mystic's insight. She could choose her role, her tint in the spectrum. She could resolve rather than refute. It was her place to inherit black magic, not defend it. The Taoesh had designed this moment. Relinquish, and let black magic design its fate. Resolve bore Cassandra's amethyst gaze to match the pixie princess's predatory stare. Cassandra gently pulled down Rusty's defensive hold, trying to pass her confidence on with a half-smile. Cassandra stood up, her majesty balancing her against the jostle of the runaway cart. She stepped over the vizier's sprawled legs, closer to the pixie. Daryl's hand took her arm in protest. He pleaded with fate-fearing tears, but his princess spared him no mercy. He recoiled apologetically, resigning himself to silent prayers of contrition. Cassandra fell to her knees before the hip-high pixie. She could smell the pixie's dingy perfume, the scent of rot, of mold, wet, stale, sour. A trait of deconstruction, of disassembly, permeated every nuance of the pixie's being. Could she weather and erode everything that fell in her hands? Have it, then. Cassandra was almost more curious than fearful of the consequences of Sedwa obtaining black magic.